Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have Gary Hutt. Gary, how was your experience in Paris?
Really good, mate. I think like it's just a different experience going off to an Olympic Games, and you don't often there's not a lot that you can really compare it to. Like I've been to plenty of major sporting events before, and this like I went to Tokyo as well, and yeah, the difference this time round with having spectators in the venues and the real buzz around the city, being able to get out and about, it was great. Yeah, working with the squad, coming away with two medals was brilliant
Nice.
as well.
No, that's awesome. And I think it would be cool for the listeners and myself just to kind of dive into that whole Paris Olympic preparation experience and kind of give people a little insight into what goes on, I guess, leading up and during the games, because it's something that most people don't get to see and experience kind of what goes on there. And I think there's a lot of stuff that's still practical and can be applied to potentially other fighters, maybe gearing up for big tournaments or big fights as well. So maybe we start from before the games and let's just talk about the lead up. So obviously, with the Olympics, you're working in like 4 year cycles. You've got other big events in between. So when did, I guess, say how far out was kind of like that first week focus on, okay, now we're preparing for the Olympics?
Well, this is a really interesting one in that because although it's a 4 year cycle, this one was unique in the fact that because COVID affected Tokyo, this was only a 3 year cycle. So, particularly in boxing, like where our program, we churn a lot of the athletes and a lot of our guys, once they've been to a games or once they've been targeted games, they turn pro. So we end up with a new cohort each games. There was only one athlete this games that went to Tokyo and stayed on. That was Charlie Davison at 54 kilogram. So the rest of the squad was completely fresh, new, coming up through the system whilst the Tokyo games were going on. So really, like I guess the push starts like before Tokyo for this crew because we're trying to help them develop and gain experience and exposure right before even Tokyo started. But then it really kind of starts to amp up in that year or two before. So what people kind of miss is that to get to a games, you have to qualify for a games, and like obviously that's fairly expected, fairly normal. But to be able to qualify for a games, you have to be selected to go to the qualifier. So the boxers already have gone through an internal kind of competitive process to get to go to a qualification to try and qualify for the games. Now, for us, that first qualification opportunity was the European Championships last year, the European Games last year, which was 12 months before. So our guys needed to be kind of peaking around that competition to be able to secure their spot at the earliest opportunity. But then it's not just the selection for that. To get selected, you have to go and compete in a few smaller tournaments and be successful. So what we'd usually look for is kind of anything up to about 12 bouts a year for the boxers to go and get exposed in competition. So to get selected or to try and guarantee your spot at the weight class, you really need to win kind of 12 out of 12 bouts in a year to solidify yourself. So performing at a high level for a long period over a year out from the games. And that involves 3 or 4 different more local competitions, but still having to go and compete against the guys that are also trying to compete to go to the games and be successful. Where does the question, where does the games prep start? It's probably
Ongoing.
2 years prior to the games, like where you want somebody to be really in a position to go and start winning consistently.
So you obviously mentioned 12 bouts in a year. That's a lot of fights. So how does strength and conditioning fit around that? Because if you're I'm assuming all those fights are important because they're all qualifications. So obviously you probably can't get too gung ho and maybe do a lot of, say, volume or preparation work. So it's a very general question of how it looks, but just a general idea of kind of how the S&C fits around that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where I think the small distinctions between the amateur side and the pro side become important because when I say 12 bouts, like if our guys were to go to a competition, in an ideal world, they'd get 3 or 4 bouts in a competition if they go through the rounds and win.
Gotcha.
So in actual fact, 12 bouts might only be 3 performance opportunities. And then that means that we can gear our training around those key events, those key opportunities. Now that's assuming that people go and win every bout they're in and go to a handful of competitions. What happened in this cycle was that not everybody was successful in every single competition. So boxers wanted to go out to multiple competitions and different opportunities to try and get that exposure and win. And that was where a little bit of the challenge and nuance around trying to plan and program around what peaking and tapering looks like, versus what physical development looks like. And we've got into a reasonable rhythm around kind of having a 3-week comp prep, a 5-week comp prep, to be able to kind of give that little bit of peaking and tapering, whilst also then dedicating a lot of the block to physical development. And then when you throw in international training camps on top of that, it just gets a little messy. But from an S&C point of view, that's where I don't think it's just about sticking to a plan. It's about like, how do you execute a plan in an effective way to achieve the adaptation you want.
Yeah, for sure. So how does that, say, 3 or 5 week peaking tapering kind of block look versus, say, the physical development block?
So, like, as you'll know, because we've spoken before, like at GB Boxing, we have a fairly structured program when we're in Sheffield around. We consistently use running as a modality for conditioning, and we've got a strong philosophy in like non-sport specific conditioning being a priority when we're trying to develop physicality. We've also got a consistent exposure to kind of strength modes through the week. 2 or 3 lifting sessions a week is pretty standard. And then the coaches will manipulate their sparring and technical load throughout the period. Now, we use the analogy. So when we're looking at kind of physical programming, the seesaw might be weighed down towards my side, but the boxing coaches are aware that that's the focus. And then when we're getting closer to competition, the seesaw will tip, and we'll be much more interested in prepping for peak performance in sparring, prepping for peak performance in competition. And then that 3 to 5 week block from our end, we'll still have the core training sessions that we deliver around a couple of runs, a couple of lifts a week. But the emphasis becomes much more kind of, as an example, like we'll use a lot of interval runs in the conditioning prep when it's a physical focus. When we move into competition, we tend to move towards more like fartlek delivery, where it's trying to mimic the demands of the sport more than drive physical change. Taper down the volume of running and increase the intensity of running. So our guys like regularly sprint. We'll do sprint training sessions at least once a week, and in that taper it'll probably be slightly more weight towards sprinting than the longer slow endurance, as long as people are on weight. And then the lifting side is much more traditional. Like we'll try and drive like hypertrophy or strength gains outside of that competition block, but we'll adjust the training into the competition block, going through shorter ranges of motion, using more explosive modalities, and we've integrated loads more med ball work into what we do in the last cycle as well.
Nice. So let's start with the running side. So you mentioned you're doing more interval style based outside during the physical development block, and then you say more fartlek style and sprints in the competition block. So does any of that, obviously you mentioned longer style stuff if they're not on weight, but in the physical development block, is there any kind of, I guess what people would say when you say running, Rocky Balboa, Mike Tyson road work kind of thing, or just those intervals? And then with fartlek, are you prescribing what's happening there, or are you kind of leaving it as play, as it's, originally a thing where they kind of just go and do their own thing and kind of change the pace as they feel?
Yeah. Interesting question. Like in our philosophy, we do use, I wouldn't call it Rocky Balboa or traditional boxing training, but like more tempoed zone 2 work. So we use a critical speed model to prescribe hours for the boxers, and they're all quite clued in with using Strava and different tracking tools to be able to be really specific about what they're executing. And that's the highest priority thing. It's like we need to create the stimulus for the adaptation we want. So the adaptation we're looking for a lot of the time during that kind of the times where we're a long way out of competition are those more aerobic, more recovery related type adaptations. And we talk to the coaches with that around, and the boxers around, well, in our circumstance, that's the type of fitness that's going to help you perform across multiple bouts in a short time frame and recover effectively, or be able to keep up a tempo across the whole of a bout. Now, with the critical speed model, we can be really specific about the tempos we want guys to run at. So it doesn't necessarily end up being like that long, slow, ploddy type traditional boxing training, traditional boxing running. It does link towards more of that. And I think like I've got guys going up to like 40 to 60 minutes on a run like that. If it's the adaptation we're looking to try and chase.
Gotcha. And then the fartlek, is that kind of just they do their own thing, or you're prescribing kind of what they're doing there?
No, so again, it's quite prescriptive in what we do. Like we'll also include some sustained reps in that. So even though we're doing up down tempos in a certain structure, we might do a session where it's 5 3-minute intervals, but across 4 of those, there's different variations of up and down tempo.
Gotcha.
And again, when we're close into competition, we might bias that towards more of a like when you're up tempo, you're really high up, and when you're down tempo, you're really slow. Versus further away from competition, where we might kind of sit more of a middle ground and have a short shift around a particular tempo, but we're always really quite prescriptive over how that works. And it leans in a little bit. I guess we've spoken previously about that peripheral conditioning, and some of the podcasts you've done previously with Andrew Usher and the guys play into some of our thinking around this, but our fartleks end up being a slight extension of that as well.
Yeah. Are you jumping on the bike as well and doing various bike sprints, since you mentioned that peripheral stuff?
We're super lucky in GB boxing that we've got an altitude tent, and we've got a physiologist dedicated to supporting training, load monitoring, and all the bells and whistles. So our preferred mode of training in the altitude, where we're trying to focus on generating those peripheral adaptations, is like an assault bike or a watt bike. For particular like athlete profiles, we'll give them some extra bike work around sessions, which is more peripherally focused. Particularly if we feel like they're going to get a really strong adaptation from that, and like usually the guys with a little bit more, so those explosive like 55 60 centimeter counter movement jumpers, or those plus 4 RSI type guys who are strong and fast. we tend to use the bike a little bit to be able to bury them in that peripheral kind of adaptation focus.
Is the use of doing it in altitude just so you can essentially up the physiological load without having such a high, I guess, output on there?
Yeah, so it's trying to play on the idea that, well, that type of training, I'm sure your audience will know if they've tried it, like, is horrible, hard stuff. All we tend to try and use the altitude for is really to add additional stress to that really potent stimulus.
Gotcha.
And make it even more potent. Now, particularly around driving, like the reason we use that is to drive recovery kinetics. So if our logic is that if the ambient oxygen in the air is lower, it's going to force or challenge recovery kinetics even more than if it was in like an ambient oxygen level. Now, there's also a slight bit of psychophysiological piece to that, in that the guys find it hard. They feel really confident off the back of executing really hard sessions, and there's a logical premise as to why it would be effective as well.
I can imagine if you're able to smash a session in there, feel wasted, then have that similar feeling out in normal oxygen, then you're recovering fast. You're like, oh, I feel good still, and then that's just that mental state would be enough.
I think it's really underrated, actually. If you do it in a smart way, being able to execute a really hard conditioning session, say in the start of the day, and then be able to spar effectively at the end of the day, like I know usually we'd try and steer clear of that from a physiology and S&C point of view to try and make sure that sparring's really the priority session.
Mm.
But sometimes in the phase, it's really useful as a confidence piece for the athletes to know, and I know they take a lot from it, that, okay, they've gone and executed a really tough conditioning session, and then they've still been able to spar at the level that they need to be able to compete. So when they're fresh, the sparring level can go even higher.
Mm.
And taking that confidence into a bout where you're by yourself in the ring and you need to just rely on what you've got, knowing that you've got that in the locker is really, really, really powerful.
Are those hard altitude sessions, are they like up to 10-minute kind of sprint intervals, or are we going like longer?
No, so they're really, really short, like maximal sprint efforts. And in fairness, those altitude sessions will tend to bolt onto the back of a session rather than
Gotcha.
do it earlier
Yeah.
in the day. And so it might be like the last thing that a boxer does with us in the week, so that they can leave with that big peripheral hit, but also that in that hormonal state to adapt for a few days. Now they'll look something like 4 to 6, 10 to 20-second max sprints off of a double work to rest ratio.
Gotcha.
And then do a set of maybe 2 or 3 sets of that, sometimes 4 if it's really extreme. But so they're doing 15 minutes of total work, and in that they're probably doing maximum 5 minutes of actual work.
Gotcha.
So it's really like quite aggressive stuff, but driving that very muscular adaptation, hopefully.
Mm. No, I like that. And then regarding going back to the critical speed, is that something that someone listening to this could implement now, just
Yeah,
on their own? And if so, how?
absolutely. So it comes from a lot of the research on like critical power on watt bikes and different some of the cycling research. But the main reason we use it is because it allows us to program really individually and specifically for a large cohort of athletes. So as I've said to you before, mate, like we're dealing with say 40 to 50 athletes in any given like training phase. So even if that's 20 on a track, it's still 20 people to individually program for. Now, the way that we apply it is we take a 1K time trial and a 3K time trial, which roughly equates to a 3-minute effort and a 12-minute effort, 10 to 12-minute effort. You can use those 2 points to map on the curve what your expected maximum exertion at a given time might be. So we can look at our critical speed model and predict somebody's 10-minute max effort speed versus their 11-minute max effort speed or their 3-minute max effort speed. And we use that to inform the training sessions that the guys do. So we end up with a setup where the guys know exactly what distance they should cover for any given interval with the stimulus that we're looking to try and achieve in that session to get the adaptation across 20 people. So it makes life quite simple. But if it's useful for you, mate, and I don't know whether it'd be useful for your audience, like I can send over some reference papers that we've drawn on, just 100%. For people to be able to get a bit of an idea of how that might work in practice for them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, send those through and I'll email them out as well. And I guess regarding the critical speed then, so you going, say, a percentage of that maximum speed for a certain time?
No, so the way that the critical speed model works is that the idea of a critical speed is like an aerobic speed that you can maintain for say 20 to 25 minutes. And then you've got like an anaerobic fuel tank which you can spread across the time that you want to work for as if it's a maximal effort. So my critical speed might predict out at say 5 meters a second. Like so my running speed for 20 to 25 minutes that I can keep up quite comfortably is 5 meters a second. I might have this fuel tank of distance that I can then spread across an effort. So if I'm going to do a 5-minute effort, I can take that fuel tank and split it into 5 minutes worth of extra speed. So I might have an extra meter a second, but I can only last 5 minutes at that speed. So I know then, rather than working as a percentage off of a speed, it's like our anaerobic fuel tank, which we refer to as distance prime D prime, but in the research they talk about W prime.
Hmm.
When you're on a bike and looking at how much power you've got remaining, we can use that to estimate what speeds our guys would be able to work at, and we're working then on meters per second speeds for certain
Yeah.
times. It makes it a lot simpler than trying to work out and use guesswork trying to estimate off of percentages from a key speed. So we've looked at like anaerobic speed reserve and approaches around that, or maximal aerobic speed and different programming tools around that. But we find that the critical speed model allows us to be a little bit more specific in the stimulus that we're applying.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna have to read through some of those so I can get my head around some of that stuff you mentioned there. Around working off the different meters per second, the different speeds there. I know I guess the anaerobic speed reserve there. I'm sure it's making a comeback recently. I see more and more stuff about it, more and more people talking about it. So it's obviously coming back around in cycles. Is that something that you already looked into, or something that is still part of that philosophy?
Yeah, so it's a really good question actually, James, because one of the challenges with the critical speed model is that when you get in towards kind of a more neuromuscular effort, so like a sprint effort, it becomes a little bit less accurate. So it's quite good at predicting anything from like a 2-minute effort out to 30 or 40 minutes. But underneath a 2-minute effort, it's not very good. If you're working as like a maximal effort. Now, the anaerobic speed reserve, we've had a play with trying to use our 2 time points of a 1k speed and a 3k speed, along with our maximal velocity in a sprint,
Yeah.
to try and give the model a little bit more of a clear idea of that shorter time period or shorter interval speed. But I wouldn't be able to say that we've like really nailed that yet. We've not been able to reconcile like programming with anaerobic speed reserve, where it's a little bit more relative percentage based than with the model around critical speed. But I think there is a way. I think there would be a way of doing it if you really dug into it.
It's interesting for anyone listening. It's kind of just seeing your maximum speed and then the speed at essentially, I guess, the top of your quote unquote aerobic gas tank, that speed, and then kind of seeing that difference. And obviously you can plot athletes and see, hey, this one maybe needs more speed, this one maybe needs more, say, base work or whatever it is. But yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting concept. But kind of when I think about it as well, it's kind of like, well, you're always trying to improve both. So would it influence programming that much? Because are you going to prescribe from an anaerobic speed reserve? Or I mean, I guess you could prescribe from the MAS number and maybe from the max velocity number, but I don't know what much else you could do that would really influence programming to a great extent. Maybe you've got an idea there.
When we try to look at it, in general, what we'll see as 2 polar profiles in boxing will be like the really kind of explosive guy that perhaps can't endure,
Yeah.
and the really endurance focused guy who can't explode.
Yeah.
And I think the anaerobic speed reserve does a really good job of like separating those two out.
Gotcha. Yeah.
That distinction in physiology will sometimes adapt the way that we try and tackle certain training sessions. So if we're doing a peripheral training session on the track, so one that we use with that for the guys is like a 300 meter max efforts. So our guys will do a 300 in maybe 40 to 45 seconds.
Damn, that sounds brutal, doing 5 300s.
Yeah, so we do it on a 5-minute rolling clock. So
Yeah.
like they'll do 40 seconds work and have four and a half
Gotcha.
minutes off nearly. Now, for a combat sport athlete, that feels like eternity. Like it's almost painful to recover that long. But what it means is they can execute really well in the reps. Now, the guys that are more neuromuscularly explosive or more explosive, that's a really good session for that. Long time recovery gives them a really good chance to try and recover and execute really well, and it's a real test to execute well every time. The less explosive, more endurance based guys tend to just tick that session off pretty easily because they're not able to bury themselves as badly.
Yeah.
Now, what we tend to do to try and achieve the same, obviously that leads to a completely different stimulus for those two guys in the session. If we've
Yeah.
got a real clear idea of the stimulus we want, we tend to adapt the session that the different profiles are executing to try and achieve the same stimulus. So we'll either bring the recovery down for the more endurancey guys, or I was going to say up the speed for the speed guys, but you can't up the speed if you're going max. So we kind of tend to migrate those endurance guys down towards a lower recovery to challenge that stimulus a little bit more.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. Do you have more?
Yeah, it was just that,
No.
that
Yep.
playing that back into how does it inform our programming or differentiate
Yeah.
between different boxes. That's like a practical example of how that might play out on the track in Sheffield.
Perfect. No, that makes sense. And I also wanted to take this as well. So we've talked a little bit about the peaking tapering phase. It'll be good to get an idea of maybe how, obviously there's peaking tapering and then there's peaking tapering. I mean, it'll be similar, but for the Olympic Games, obviously a massive, like the pinnacle event you're trying to peak for. So maybe like 1 to 2 weeks out, how does that look? Does it look any different to maybe a different competition or something that you peaked or tapered for earlier? Or is it just kind of taking what you know worked there, bringing it over here, and everything's exactly the same?
It's a really interesting one. That I think this is quite. I think in combat sport, peaking and tapering is really difficult to monitor and measure. So like because it's so multifaceted, you go so much technical skill involved. I think that drawing on the research from like historic peaking and tapering, where it's all in athletics or
Yeah.
like a very controlled setting, and just applying it, I don't think it necessarily fits the profile for a combat sport athlete, especially when there's like in the Olympic Games, we've got potentially 4 to 5 bouts across 14 days for some of our guys. So that peaking phase, although you've got a peak for every single bout, could last for 2 weeks. Now, for the approach that we take at GB is we like to try and make sure that physicality wise the boxers are prepped up and peaking maybe a week or 2 weeks prior to getting to competition, and then almost do the minimum possible to be able to support the boxing load.
Gotcha.
So ideal world, the guys will be in and around a weight where they're happy to be able to get down for competition 2 weeks out. They'll be hitting their key lifts, they'll be hitting their numbers, their explosive measures, they'll be hitting all of their physical bits back in Sheffield 2 to 3 weeks out from the games. And then the 2 weeks leading in, we'll be looking at maintaining those physical qualities more than trying to change anything or push them on. And if anything, if they're boxing regularly through the week, if they're doing a little bit of training with myself in the gym and a little bit on the track, like it's very rare for us to see somebody kind of lose those physical qualities. If anything, we tend to see people hiding those physical qualities through fatigue. Doing a little bit too much. So a lot of our tapering, peaking and tapering approach, particularly with the games, is around can we remove a lot of the work so that the athlete can just be fresh and be ready to execute.
Yeah. How do you handle then maybe for, I don't know if you get this, I'm sure most coaches, including myself, always get it like, are we doing enough? And I'm sure the athletes also feel the same, or maybe even express the same potentially of, I need to do more. Well, how are you addressing that, and how are you kind of wrestling with that concept in those 2 weeks?
I think it becomes so individual with the athlete then. So that all becomes relationship based. And I mean, first thing, one of the major reasons we use testing data is to support the athlete in understanding where they're at and what they're entering the competition with. So we'll do a lot of our testing battery, say 2 to 3 weeks out from competition.
And that shows them like you're ready.
Yeah, so they're like, then if they're ready, they've got that to be able to support the idea that they're ready. And then it just becomes an idea of, well, what's minimum viable dose? And if we can just keep upticking that physical quality while you're freshening up to be able to box, you're focusing wholly on your sparring and making sure that you're fresh and ready for all of that work, and executing like above and beyond what you can do in your sparring, that's also going to have a maintenance quality, because there's loads of strength qualities and loads of conditioning qualities which are getting challenged in the sparring setting as well as everything else. So if anything, we want to feel like you're twitchy and ready to go and like agitated to be able to perform, not buried under a load of fatigue and like cautious to perform. Not everybody buys into the process. Everybody gets a little bit nervous and jittery, especially at like the highest performance level, which is where we were talking about that long tail of performance before the games. Hopefully we make a lot of the mistakes along the way. We've had athletes who attended the games just gone that have done 10k runs less than a week out from boxing at smaller competitions. They've done like ton-up circuits and stuff 2 days out from competition. I think one of the things that we try and do and make sure that we're quite good at is supporting the athlete around that, so they can be honest with what they're doing in the training, and then debriefing if anything like that happens during smaller, less arguably less important competitions in the Olympic Games. But I think that's one of the real powers of like the amateur side of combat sport versus the professional side, because at the end of the day, if our guys go out to a competition in Mongolia and they lose a bout, it's not the end of the world. Like whereas in the pro world, I think there's that real emphasis on keeping your zero and making sure like you're never even you're never risking a loss. And that brings so much more pressure around a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and the big money as well, I guess. And I guess if you're supporting, say, a pro like that, and you're like telling them not to do something, it's kind of like, the other one making the money, the other one probably paying you the big bucks too, so they're just like whatever. But what does that minimum viable dose or maintaining look like compared to, say, the weeks before? Are we talking? And maybe it's going to are the sessions reduced, or is it the same sessions, or what in the sessions are reduced and what's changed?
So frequency of sessions stays the same.
Okay.
So we're trying to get lots of little frequent exposures to not a lot of work. But the content of those sessions has changed over the time that I've worked with GB boxing. So historically, I'm really biased towards like very high force actions, slow high force actions. But more recently, I've probably biased more towards like high force but fast and velocity based.
So do you want to give it a couple of examples of what those would be?
Yeah, so like in the Tokyo cycle, I probably would have tapered with like something like a 3-3s back squat.
Yeah.
But a really high load. And almost try and hit a 3RM within the week of competition, because then we know it's very, very low volume, so the actual like the hangover from that is going to be quite low. But we're ensuring that max force is definitely up there, whereas the period into the Paris Games just gone, we used a lot like lower load but faster movements. So if we were going to do a high force modality, it'd probably be through restricted range and go like a partial squat rather than a full squat. We used isometrics a little bit more. Again, just quality assuring a max force hit. And then I feel comfortable and confident that if we're getting a max force hit in a really low fatigue way every couple of days, 2 to 3 days or twice a week, even in fight week, then the guys are going to be in a really good place to be able to express max force in the ring.
No, I'm with you. And the condition? How does the conditioning change?
So that's where we'd follow a much more traditional like volume cut, intensity increase. So we'll if there's no problem with weight management, we'll cut into like much more of a repeated speed type block, where we'll do one. If we traditionally do 3 runs a week, we'll still maintain that all the way in through competition up till about 5 days out, where they just move into more of a recovery and regen type phase. We'll keep one fartlek interval in there as our kind of VO2 max type hit, and then the other runs will either be weight making steady state or recovery steady state. And you can kind of interchange that however you want to kind of package it up. And then we'll do speed, repeated speed, and height. Again, it's like a high force velocity hit.
Gotcha. You say recovery, low intensity, or weight making low intensity. Are they two different modalities for you?
I mean, effectively they're the same thing, and it depends a
Okay.
little bit on the athlete as well. We've got some athletes that really love to run, and they find a lot of like psychological benefit to being able to get out and doing a steady run.
Yeah.
Whereas we've got other athletes who could think of nothing worse than going out and going for a steady run.
Yeah.
So again, that's where like individual tailoring and coaching, having an understanding of the stimulus we're looking to achieve, whether it might be weight making or whether it might be like some recovery mode, and then spinning the modality for the athlete in the way that they find most productive for them.
Gotcha.
I'm really comfortable to adapt programming around that.
Gotcha. And then, so that's leading into the tournament or the game. So then, obviously, you mentioned some guys might have 4 or 5 bouts over 2 weeks. So how does the S&C change and work through that time? Are they still getting the gym? Are they still doing any kind of running with that?
So the way that we approach that is the same way we approach it for normal competitions, and that's as soon as they've started their competition, I'll be completely hands off. So although the games ran through till just gone Sunday, the 12th, I travelled home from Paris on the 31st of July, which left most of the competition phase without an S&C coach on the ground because I don't tend to deliver a lot during competition. The other element to that, though, is that I really spend a lot of time trying to give the athletes kind of collaboration and autonomy in the program. So it was really one of the things I'm most proud of in terms of our programming over the last 5-6 years is the way that the athletes were able to self-manage whilst they were out in the games. Lewis Richardson is a great example of somebody who went and was successful, won a bronze medal, but he sent me a text kind of 7 days before his competition start with what he thought his program should look like, and I didn't have to change one thing because he's picked up and understood what is important for him, and I can check and challenge his programming rather than feed him the programming. And I think that's the place that we're trying to get to in terms of the way that we educate and support the athletes as well as train the guys. And across the squad, like Rosie Eccles, Delicious Ore, Charlie Davison, all of those guys, they're all been in the system and they're all able to kind of operate in that way and understand what they feel is right for them, and then have a discussion and a collaboration in terms of the programming.
Yeah, that's
So
huge.
when I'm not there, if they feel like they need to do some stuff, they can get on the phone. We have a little conversation. The coach is involved in that process, and the coaches are able to support the athlete to execute if I'm not there.
Was there a point in time with maybe some of the old athletes when you first came in where that wasn't the case in terms of what they showed you or maybe what they wanted to do during competition?
Yeah, so I mean, like the guys, like historically as a program, GB boxing tend not to do any S&C related work in the competition phase. But yeah, definitely when I first came into the program, we had athletes that were just happy to be told what to do, and that's cool as well. Like that's in a sense that's them knowing how they want to function. I'm really happy to facilitate that as well. If anything, it makes my job easier. But as I say, over the Paris cycle, one thing that I've really doubled down on and tried to make sure we're in a place to support is like the athlete autonomy and athletes making decisions around like what's effective in a warm up, how can they warm themselves up effectively, like 20 warm ups a week. Like if I still need to show them how to do a warm up in the competition, like in the warm up area prior to a bout, I haven't done my job right, I don't think.
Yeah.
And really, that warm up area for me then becomes, well, it's a space for the athletes and the coaches to get really geared in on what they want to do in the ring. So if I can remove myself from that because the athlete's educated on what they want to do and they're autonomous on it, like that's a great thing.
Yeah. And obviously some very successful sporting teams have that kind of self-managed autonomy, athlete autonomy. And I know the Crusaders were the most successful, I guess you call them provincial or franchise rugby teams in the world. They had a lot of input from players into, what should go in their program, what lifts they like to do, what they know works for them and stuff like that. And huge for buy-in as well, eh?
I mean, it elevates the level of coaching conversation that you can have. So something that myself and the team that support the guys from an S&C point of view talk about a lot is, well, we want to elevate our conversations with the athlete. We haven't got all the information that we need to be able to have good quality conversations, because a lot of it's internal to the way that one of the guys is feeling, or how they've been for the last week, or what they've been up to for the days before their competition or their training session, or I can predict out what I'd like to get from the training session, but how to actually execute that based on the state they arrive and the state they leave into the next session, there's loads of information in there that I can't predict and won't know, unless I've got an athlete that's able to have a conversation about where they're at, what they've done. They trust enough to be able to share exactly what where their training is at, and then are able to happily kind of make decisions around how they want to work and share their points of view.
Perfect. And you mentioned as well about hitting those physical, I guess, numbers leading in, say, 2-3 weeks out. What are some of those KPIs that you're looking at that for you are maybe important for boxing performance, or just important for the athletes to be able to see?
Yeah, so I mean, we put a lot of stock in our 1K time around that critical speed model that we were talking about. We always do a 1K time trial 2 weeks out from competition, and unless there's a structural reason why we can't, in which case we'll do it a week before that. And we see a lot of correlation with performance in that 1K and conditioning measures I'll say conditioning measures, but conditioning performance in the ring in amateur boxing. We look at hitting 1RMs in the kind of 2 to 4 weeks prior to competition. If
and that'd be like squat, bench, and maybe pull up.
Yeah, so we do squat and pull up.
Gotcha.
And then some trap bar, some deadlift variations, but again, it becomes a little bit more individual around that. We look at counter movement jump and reactive strength index on the drop jump. So something that we see, and I can't really fathom, but I can understand to an extent, like our guys are just ridiculously good at reactive strength in a drop jump, particularly around like achieving really fast contact times. Now, and there's also a really clear correlation between performance level and reactive strength index. So I think the last time we spoke about our athlete database, but the data that we've got indicates that RSI in a drop jump is really, really important to performance level in boxing. Now, if guys are hitting in and around their best performances for those type of measures, then we're pretty happy. So actually, the testing battery that we rely on and draw confidence on in the build-up to competition is pretty tight. It's only a handful of things, but we try and nail those things really well.
Are you standardizing the height for the drop jump, and are you setting a threshold for ground contact time?
So we do it off a 30 centimeter box. We use arm swing. I don't standardize a cut off for the contact time. I think what I like to consider is, well, I actually want to drive faster contact time. I want to make the contact time the priority thing, and then be able to execute height off of the back of it. So if somebody's got the skill to be able to do like a 125 contact time and still drive height behind it, I'm super happy with that, because that's like a specific adaptation to the sport. Like,
but are you saying maybe discounting or like long ground contact time? Say someone goes 500 milliseconds on the ground, and you kind of like, maybe we do that again.
Yeah, do you know what? I just never see that. We do cue it as be fast first and then jump high. So it's more, and I'd almost separate out, like I'd call a longer contact time like that, say like a depth jump, where it's almost a augmented eccentric into a counter movement jump. Yeah,
exactly.
So we just discount that from our testing, like, and we use that as a training tool. So we'll use varying height depth jumps in training, but always to drive either counter movement jump height or drop jump performance.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. Do you do you prescribe, say, drop jump or depth jump in training, potentially not based on training age or training status, but to a certain maybe cohort of training status? So for example, someone came in with a very low, maybe gym training age, maybe doesn't have the strength behind them. Would you still be prescribing that from a maybe a reactive strength, elastic standpoint, or would you be kind of building up to that first?
We include it in our assessment of boxers coming onto the GB program.
Yeah.
So we'll have a drop jump, we'll coach them and familiarise them in the session and then get them to do the test. That's because of the correlation with boxing and the amount of ankle conditioning that comes just generally through the sport.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's not even taking into account like skipping as a mode for conditioning
Yeah.
in most amateur clubs.
Exactly.
So I'm fairly confident a lot of the time that our cohort of boxers are quite capable of delivering effective performance around that. I mean, if it was a group of swimmers, I probably wouldn't take the same approach.
Yeah.
But because of the nature of the sport, I think that, and it makes a lot of sense to why people would be good at that movement and why that movement then becomes such a physical characteristic we try and push, is that the sport drives the development. I've had guys come into the gym who've never touched a gym in their life, never stepped into a gym apart from they've only ever gone to a boxing gym, and they'll come and do a 4 RSI drop jump. Like, just pull out a 160 contact time with a decent jump height, and they'll be
Jeez.
like it's normal, and that's
Yeah.
off the back of only boxing training. So there's something
Yeah.
in there that really drives that adaptation, and then if we can drive that adaptation, I feel like it guarantees us a transfer to the sport.
It's funny. It kind of makes a point for maybe a lot of extensive plyometric work. Jumping rope and maybe a high volume of different bounds and jumps is more than enough to drive more intense, I guess, outputs during hard things like drop jumps.
Yeah, and I think the way that we've tried to interpret it a little bit is that like we look at foot and ankle complex as being, if they're able to maintain stiffness through that complex, then actually the hip and the knee applying force is the driving factor to being able to drop jump high.
Gotcha.
Now, if our guys are exposed to loads and loads of like low level plyos within the sport, or they're skipping a lot, like they're going to be developing ankle stiffness or the
Yeah.
ability to create ankle stiffness really regularly through the sport. We see guys drive their drop jump on through improving hip and knee extension through the training
Yeah.
program. So that's cool because I think then that mimics what we're thinking of with somebody throwing a punch. Obviously, something that we've played into a little bit more with Sam Grady-Graham coming on board, who's the other S&C coach that works with GB Boxing, is like multi-directional plyos. So looking at medial lateral shifts and looking at rotational, like transverse shifts, and how we can try and play into conditioning the foot and ankle more effectively. Which has been really cool. It's a good bit of work that Sam's been doing with the guys, and we integrate that into like track warm-ups and stuff as well. So
Nice.
it's not, we don't necessarily delineate like this is a running session, so we're only running. This is a gym session, so we're only gymming. We take opportunities wherever we can.
I love it. And before we finish this off, I have unrelated boxing S&C question about the village. Obviously, we've heard many things. Did you sleep on a cardboard bed? One, and two, was it mainly plant-based vegetarian food, or is that just all talk?
So this is the interesting thing. Like, actual spots to stay in the village for staff are quite limited. So in terms of structurally how it worked for us was that there were coaches stayed in the village with the athletes, and there were 2 members of support staff that stayed in the village.
Yeah.
One was the doctor, the other was the physio. So I didn't actually stay in the village, so I didn't have to deal with any cardboard beds or anything like that. Quite a nice hotel around the corner, actually. But the village at Paris, the feedback from the athletes was that it was quite cramped, and on top, it was quite busy compared to previously in Tokyo, the coaches were saying. The food perhaps wasn't as good as usually it's billed as. but you're still walking into a food hall that's the size of a football pitch. Um, and then actually a lot of our guys spent time at the training lodge. So although they stayed in the village, where they did most of their training was a separate facility, kind of 20 minutes down the road. And so
Yeah.
they'd travel out to us, and that's where I was doing most of my work and staying close to. Um, and that's just Team GB. So I think Team
Okay.
USA have a similar setup where they have
Hmm.
sole access to a facility, and all of the athletes from the different sports can go and train and use that space,
Gotcha.
away from the village atmosphere and strain around that. Um, so a lot of our guys were coming and eating at the performance lodge because the food there was unbelievable.
Oh, okay.
The training facilities there were top notch, and Team GB and the BOA, British Olympic Association, they do a stellar job in terms of setting that up. And then even prior to that, there's also like a holding camp. So the US guys will have had to come and travel over a couple of weeks beforehand to acclimatise to Paris time and Paris weather conditions and stuff. So they'll have housed themselves somewhere, perhaps outside of Paris, um,
Hmm.
and completed a few weeks of training prior to going into the games environment. And
Hmm.
so a lot of the like organizational logistical stress of the games comes from all of that, like having to be outside of your normal and still be able to deliver and execute well. But yeah, no cardboard beds for me, mate.
You got lucky in the end, but I appreciate you coming on, Gary, and kind of sharing your experiences around the preparation for Paris and kind of going into detail for the S&C. But people want to follow you and keep up with what's happening at GB Boxing and what you're doing. Where can they do that?
Yeah, so the best two places to keep on with what I do. I'm not super big on social media really. Like I'm a bit of a grey man. I check in on Instagram, and I'm really happy for people to follow what I do. It's just coach.hutt on Instagram, or find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to have conversations, support anybody, and I've also recently started offering some mentorship opportunities as well. So if people
Nice.
want support, then by all means reach out and we'll see if we can connect.
By mentorship, coaching or athlete? Okay,
Um, I'm
perfect.
really not just restricted to S&C either. So um, I've been in and around the system of elite sport for nearly 20 years now. And I really enjoy doing my best to try and help people maneuver through and understand how they can best like attack the problems that they've got in their training, whether they're an athlete managing their own program or coaches trying to access or be successful in the elite sport world. Um, so yeah, I'm kind of trying to just subtly and quietly go around and help people if I can help them.
Perfect. I'll link this up in the description as well for anyone. But thanks for coming on, Gary. Appreciate it.
Nice one, James.